In this video, we're going to go over some of the worst cards from the Dark Crisis pack, one of the earliest sets in Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is a pack full of terrible cards even by early Yu-Gi-Oh! Standards. And at number 10, we have Garzett. This is a level 7 monster with question mark for attack, where its attack becomes equal to the combined original attack of the two monsters used for its tribute summon. Now, the effect of this card seems like it might not be half bad. If you had two high attack monsters in the field, you could simply tribute both of them to bring out this one card. You would have a very beefy beat stick that your opponent would have a hard time beating over. However, in the same set that released this card, they also released a card called Great Garzett, which is a level 6 monster that has the effect where its attack becomes equal to twice the original attack of the monster used for its tribute summon, which is a much better effect. And the reason for that is the amount of resources in order to bring out both of them, plus the attack power values. For example, if you have two summon skulls on your side of the field, both with 2500 attack, and you tribute them both to bring out Garzett, you now have one monster with 5000 attack on the field. However, in the same exact previous board state, if you instead tribute one of them for Great Garzett, you'll have a monster with 5000 attack and a 2500 attack summon skull left, which is just more value overall. And in fact, Great Garzett was such a good card at being a great beat stick, it actually saw some competitive play. Whereas Garzett was so bad, it was purely pack filler. However, even though its effect is not that great, it's still probably better than the other cards on this list, mainly because the effect is only really bad in comparison to its much better level 6 counterpart. And at number 9, we have Rod of the Mind's Eye. This is an equipped spell card which has the effect that any damage the equipped monster deals becomes 1000 points. So, for example, if you attack directly with something like Drill Barnacle, instead of doing 300 points of damage, it would instead deal 1000. Also, if a monster has more than 1000 attack, it does the same and lowers it to only 1000. Now, this effect is kind of mediocre. Even in this time period, they had cards like Mage Power United We Stand, two cards which would give a monster well over 2000 attack points for a single equip. So making it so monsters only do 1000 points of damage was kind of an incredibly minor effect that wasn't worth using. Specifically with an equipped spell card though, because later on they did create a retrain of this card in the form of a field spell called the Temple of the Mind's Eye, which basically applies the effect of the equipped spell to all monsters on the field, where no matter how much battle damage they deal, it always becomes 1000. This was actually incredibly useful in stall decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, because with only 4000 life points and only 3 field zones, it meant if you had this field spell card out, it was impossible for your opponent to OTK you, giving you time to regain your life points and just stabilize in some other way. And it also synergized pretty well with the backup squad that allowed you to draw one card for every 1000 points of damage you took, which you were guaranteed to take exactly 1000 points of damage with each proc of Temple of Mind's Eye. However, even though the effect was useful, it wasn't useful if it was only on equipped spell card given to a single monster on your side of the field, and was more useful on your opponent's monsters from doing too much damage to you, and only really in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links with 3 field zones. And at number 8, we have Battle Scarred. This is a continuous trap card which has the effect where you select one of your Archfiend monsters, then each time you would pay life points during your standby phase for the monster's maintenance costs, your opponent also pays the same amount of life points. Now, the original line of Archfiend monsters added in this set could all also probably make this list, since they were infamously bad. They all had very low attack points, they had maintenance costs during your standby phase, and the effects of the cards were incredibly minor. Dark Bishop Archfiend, for example, only has 300 attack and has an effect where if an Archfiend monster on your side of the field is targeted for a card effect, you can roll a 6-sided die. And if the result is 1, 3, or 6, you get to negate and destroy that card. However, all of the other first-gen Archfiend monsters also had a similar effect of target protection, so granting it to another Archfiend monster wasn't super necessary, especially on such a weak body that required a maintenance cost and couldn't even special summon itself. Vilepon Archfiend also had a 500 life point maintenance cost, could negate on a roll of a 3 that targeted it, and only had the effect where your opponent could only attack this card instead of your other Archfiend monsters, and with only a paltry 1200 attack and no way to special summon itself, was kind of useless. Infernal Queen Archfiend could negate on a roll of a 2 or a 5 that targeted it, only had 900 attack, and had the effect to increase the attack of one Archfiend monster by 1000 points until the end phase during the standby phase. So, you wouldn't even be able to gain the attack until your opponent's turn rolled around, or if you somehow survived until your next turn, where it could maybe become a 1900 attack beat stick. Probably the most useful card was Shadow Knight Archfiend, which had an impressive 2000 stat line for a level 4 monster, where it can negate card effects that target it if it rolled a 3, had a 900 life point maintenance cost, the largest of all the other Archfiend monsters, and had a negative effect where it dealt half battle damage to your opponent. And again, none of these cards could special summon themselves. They were all incredibly weak besides Shadow Knight and Terror King, and the support cards weren't super good, especially when you had stuff like Battle Scar that just made your opponent also pay your maintenance costs with you. So if you equipped it to Shadow Knight Archfiend, which paid 900 life points, the largest amount out of all of them, That meant you could basically burn 900 damage to your opponent every standby phase, but didn't even prevent you from taking the damage yourself. And while 900 damage every turn from one card is decent for continuous trap burn damage, it's not from one card. It's a 2-card combo that can be interrupted from either of them being destroyed. And at that point, it's definitely not worth the effort to use it, because there's plenty of other burn strategies to use that don't involve using one of the worst initial archetypes ever made, because the rest of the archetype had nothing to do with burn damage either. And at number 7, we have Agido. This is a level 4 fairy monster, which has the effect that if it's destroyed by battle specifically, you can roll a 6-sided die. Then, based on the result you get, you can special summon a fairy type monster from your graveyard whose level is exactly equal to the number rolled. Or if it was 6, you can special summon a level 6 or higher fairy monster from your graveyard. Now, the problem with this card is that most people who play decks full of monsters generally play monsters of a single type of level, not a whole variety of levels. So if you're playing a whole bunch of level 4 fairy monsters, Agido would only have a positive effect if you rolled exactly a 4, which is a very low 1 in 6 chance. However, even if Agido was able to special summon a monster regardless of its dice roll, it still wouldn't be that useful because of all the other recruiters that existed in early Yu-Gi-Oh!, which for the same condition could special summon a monster from your deck. The obvious bonus of this card was a chance to maybe summon a high level monster from your graveyard, which isn't really worth the amount of effort required to do that. Since you need to get the high level fairy monster in the graveyard, you have to make sure Agido is destroyed specifically by battle, and then you have to roll a 6 on a dice roll, which is way too much effort for trying to special summon a high level monster. They did, however, retrain this card in the modern era with a much better effect, where if this card is sent from your hand or deck to the graveyard, you can send the top 5 cards of both players' decks to the graveyard. Then, if you have Exchange of the Spirit in the grave, you can send another 5 more cards from either player's deck to the graveyard. Additionally, if it's in your hand, it has a hand effect, which is more similar to its old school effect, where if cards are sent from the hand or deck to either player's graveyard, you can special summon this card from your hand, then special summon a level 4 Earth Fairy monster from your graveyard as well, except another copy of itself. If Agido had its new effect back in the day, it might have actually seen competitive play because of how useful your deck was even in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Not even counting the effect of being able to special summon a monster from the graveyard with its hand effect, something that was incredibly rare back then. And at number 6, we have Dark Scorpion Gorg the Strong. This is a level 5 monster which has the effect that if it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you can activate one of its 2 effects, where you can either return one of your opponent's monsters to the top of their deck, which is one of the best forms of removal I might add, or send the top card of their deck to the graveyard, which is an incredibly minor effect. So, if you manage to actually inflict battle damage with this card, you did get a really good removal effect, or incredibly minor mill effect. However, here are the problems with this card. For one, it's a level 5 monster with only 1800 attack. At this point in time, we had terrible archetypes like Archfiend monsters with 2000 attack on a level 4 monster. So a lot of high attack, low level monsters could just beat over this card. And since its condition for getting its effect off was to deal battle damage, that was kind of a problem. So if your opponent only had monsters with more than 1800 attack on their side of the field, you wouldn't be able to use the effect of this card, which under best case scenario would allow you to remove some of your opponent's monsters. So it had a monster removal effect that was reliant on it being able to deal damage, which it wasn't very good at, because it was hard to bring out and had such low stats. So the amount of resources that would be required in order to both get this card on the field and buff it up enough so it can attack over something or attack directly would not be worth only being able to return one of your opponent's cards to the top of their deck. For the same amount of effort, you could just use Phoenix Wing Wind Blast, which on a trap card they could just use during your opponent's turn to disrupt their plays, also performing the same effect for a simple discard from your hand, and did see tons of competitive play because that was really good. However, Gorg the Strong never saw any competitive play, even if some of the other Dark Scorpions did, which was another archetype pretty infamous for being really bad. And at number 5, we have Ray of Hope. This is a trap card which allows you to shuffle 2 light monsters from your graveyard back into the deck. Now, I will say, there is some merit to shuffling your own monsters back into your deck, as shown with the Ishizu Shufflers or even the Transmigration Prophecy, which was a trap card that returned 2 cards from either graveyard back into the deck. It was on the limited list for years. However, a key difference between these cards is the versatility in how many cards are able to be shuffled back and from where. The Transmigration Prophecy and the Ishizu Shufflers can target cards from both players' graveyards, which allows you to both recur resources if you need to, and more importantly, disrupt your opponent's graveyard from their graveyard effects. However, Ray of Hope only allows you to choose cards from your graveyard, and only specifically light monsters, which narrows the scope of its usability considerably. And there wasn't really any light monster support released in this set, as the Chaos monsters weren't released until the very next set, and Light Swords wouldn't come out until years later. So Ray of Hope was just kind of a random card that didn't really have any merit, because you couldn't use it to disrupt your opponent as a modular option, and its only effect wasn't very beneficial to any strategy that existed at the time. And for the light monsters it did exist for, namely the recruiters like Shining Angel perhaps, it wasn't the best use of one of your 1 cards in your deck. And at number 4, we have Dark Flare Knight. This is a fusion monster which requires a Dark Magician and a Flame Swordsman as its 2 materials, and has the effect where you take no battle damage from battles involving this card. And if it's destroyed by battle specifically, you get to special summon 1 Mirage Knight from your hand or deck. And Mirage Knight is a 2800 attack monster that can only be summoned by the effect of Dark Flare Knight, and basically has the effect where if it attacks a monster, it gains attack equal to the attack of its target. However, during the end phase in which this card was involved in a battle, it's banished. So, the intended synergy with Dark Flare Knight was to bring it out, crash into one of your opponent's monsters so it dies, then bring up Mirage Knight from your deck so you can finish the job of actually crashing over whatever you wanted to for a lot of damage. However, there's a couple of problems with this intended strategy. For one of the fusion materials for Dark Flare Knight is a fusion monster itself, the Flame Swordsman. So you either had to find some way to also bring out a terrible vanilla fusion monster, or just play a fusion substitute monster, which was a lot more practical, as there wasn't really any other options on how to bring this card out back then. However, if you did manage to use the resources to bring this card out, then you'd have to find a way to destroy it by battle in order to get its good effect. So what you could do is just bank on the fact that it had 2200 attack and use it for poking for damage, and then just have Mirage Knight as a backup option in case it gets destroyed by battle. But the problem with that is that the floating effect only procs from being destroyed by battle, and there was a plethora of monster destruction early Yu-Gi-Oh!, as well as just mind control effects to take control of it. So they could just choose to never attack it and just remove it with one of the other plethora of removal spells instead, and completely bypass the floating effect, never having to deal with Mirage Knight. And then there was the fact that you had to play Mirage Knight in your main deck, which just added an unusable Garnet that could never be summoned if you drew it into your hand, as its condition made it so it could only be summoned by Dark Flare Knight's floating effect. And that's not even counting the fact that Dark Flare Knight is weaker than one of its fusion materials. And at number 3, we have Guardian Ceal. This is a level 4 monster with 1700 attack, which cannot be summoned unless you control the equipped spell card Shooting Star Bull Seal on your side of the field in some way. Shooting Star Bull Seal has the effect where the equipped monster loses 1000 attack, but it's able to attack your opponent directly. This card was actually used in some OTK strategies over the years, but it was only ever used in incredibly specific decks that did not care at all to use something like Guardian Ceal, because they were trying to usually win on that turn by just attacking directly with a whole bunch of other equipped cards. And if you did manage to bring out Guardian Ceal, it had the effect where you could send 1 equipped spell card you control that is equipped to this card to the graveyard in order to destroy 1 monster your opponent controls. Now, here's the problem with this card. You're not able to use the original equipped card that's equipped to it on the field for its summoning requirement in the first place as the material to be used for its effect to destroy monsters, because Guardian Ceal only allows you to use equipped spells that are equipped to it currently, and not just equipped cards that you control on the field in general. So you would have to use Shooting Star Bull Seal on one of your other monsters, normal summon Guardian Ceal, then equip a different equipped spell card from your hand to it in order to destroy something. And for all the effort required to do that, it's really not worth only being able to destroy 1 monster, when you can instead just play something like Fissure. So it's basically a hard to bring out monster with an effect that wouldn't be very good even if it wasn't a hard to bring out monster, which definitely puts it into nearly garbage tier. And at number 2, we have Checkmate. This is a normal spell card which has the effect where you contribute 1 Archfiend monster you control in order to make it so a specifically named monster Terror King Archfiend on your side of the field can attack your opponent's life points directly this turn. Now, Terror King Archfiend is a level 4 monster that can only be normal summon if you already have an Archfiend monster on your side of the field. And as we discussed earlier, the other Archfiend monsters were terrible. One of the worst archetypes ever made before they released a whole bunch of retrain support that had nothing to do with the original monsters. So in order to even bring out Terror King, you had to use something like Archfiend's Roar in order to special summon one of your Archfiend monsters from your graveyard, then you could normal summon this card. Then you can activate Checkmate so that Terror King can attack for 2000 points of damage. However, what's funny about Terror King's effect is that if it destroys the monster by battle, it's able to negate the effects of the monster it destroyed, which was actually a pretty decent effect in early Yu-Gi-Oh!, where there were tons of monsters that floated when they were destroyed by battle, or flip effects. So having a card like Checkmate, which allowed it to attack directly, seemed kind of counterintuitive to its actual effects. And also, it having a cost of having to tribute an Archfiend monster specifically to use for an effect that can only work on 1 specific monster, that's not even a very good effect for that monster, is kind of all kinds of convoluted and just not very good. If anything, this might be one of the most not very good spell cards in the game that wasn't specifically designed to be bad like Cold Feet. However, the only reason this card isn't number 1 on this list is because it was also released in the same set that released one of the worst boss monsters in the game's history that's even harder to use. And at number 1, we have Exodia Necross. This is a level 4 monster with 1800 attack that can only be special summoned with the effect of Contract with Exodia. And the card Contract with Exodia has the effect where you can only activate if you have all 5 pieces of Exodia in your graveyard, which allows you to special summon Exodia Necross from your hand and not your deck. Now already, this is an incredibly difficult monster to summon, because getting 5 named monsters in your graveyard at the same time is incredibly difficult. something that would be hard to do even in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! With modern support cards, let alone cards from the early days of the game. The intended way to bring this card out easier is with the card Painful Choice, which could easily get all 5 pieces in the graveyard with one card, which is probably why they thought Contract with Exodia would be so good that they had to restrict it so you can only special summon Exodia Necross from your hand, because if it could be special summoned from the deck, it would obviously be too overpowered. Now, let's take a look at what Exodia Necross actually does when it's on the field. While it's on the field, it cannot be destroyed by battle or the effects of spell and trap cards. Then, during each of your standby phases, it gains a permanent buff of 500 attack points. And also, if at any point all 5 pieces of Exodia are not in your graveyard, or if just one of them is moved, the card will immediately destroy itself. So, having protection from battle and destruction from spell and trap effects is actually pretty decent protection for early Yu-Gi-Oh! Monster destruction effects did exist and were played, but they weren't as plentiful as spell or trap card removal. So, if you got Exodia Necross on the field, there is a chance it would probably survive for a few turns. And with it surviving for a few turns, it would probably eventually get to a high enough attack point value where they would have to have no real option for dealing with it except to draw into one of their monster removal effects, and it just leads to a really early Yu-Gi-Oh! Version of having a Towers-like monster. Luckily, early Yu-Gi-Oh! Never had to worry about this card because it was so incredibly difficult to bring out. Painful Choice wasn't banned when Exodia Necross was introduced to the game, but it was limited to one copy, which meant the combo to bring this card out was incredibly flimsy and not very consistent. You'd have to draw into Painful Choice, Exodia Necross, and Contract with Exodia in order to actually bring the card out, while also playing 5 Garnets in your deck on top of that. And if you did manage to bring all this out, there was a chance it might be able to win you the game as long as your opponent didn't have Exiled Force, Man-Eater Bug, or Tribe Infecting Virus. Alright, and that's the video. If you have any ideas for future videos similar to this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.